Shaq boards a private jet expecting a smooth flight home, but from the moment he steps inside, something feels off. The pilot, Jackson Calloway, barely acknowledges him, his smirk laced with arrogance. Subtle jabs turn into blatant disrespect, then calculated intimidation. The turbulence, not natural. The delays, intentional. Shaq stays composed, but he knows. This isn't just an ego trip. It's personal. And when Calloway takes things too far, pushing the limits of safety just to prove a point, he makes one fatal mistake. He underestimates the man in seat 1A. By the time they land, the tables will turn, and the predator? He'll be the one begging for mercy. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq adjusted his watch as he stepped onto the private jet, rolling his shoulders after a long business trip. He had spent the past few days locked in high-stakes meetings, negotiating deals worth millions. And now, he just wanted a quiet flight home. No drama, no stress. Just peace at 30,000 feet. But from the moment he stepped on board, something felt off. The flight attendant, a young woman with hesitant eyes, barely met his gaze as she welcomed him aboard. Her smile was forced, her body language stiff. Shaq gave her a polite nod, but she quickly turned away, disappearing toward the galley. Then there was the pilot, Jackson Calloway. Tall, with graying blonde hair and a smirk that looked more like a sneer, Calloway stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed. He didn't offer the usual professional greeting. No handshake, no welcome aboard. Just a brief, unreadable glance before he turned his back and strode inside. Shaq had flown enough private jets to know this wasn't normal, but he let it slide. Maybe the guy was having a bad day. Maybe the tension in the air was just his own exhaustion catching up to him. He settled into his leather seat, stretching out his legs as the engines hummed to life. He barely had time to open his tablet before the first subtle insult landed. Over the intercom, Calloway's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be departing shortly. Hope everyone here is supposed to be here." Shaq glanced up. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't react. Maybe he misheard. A few minutes later, the flight attendant, Olivia, brought him a drink. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. "You okay?" Shaq asked casually. She flinched, forcing a smile. Yes, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." Before he could respond, she hurried back toward the galley. Something wasn't right. Shaq exhaled and leaned back, keeping his expression neutral. He had dealt with men like Calloway before, men who assumed money equaled superiority, men who resented seeing power in the hands of someone who didn't fit their narrow view of who belonged. Calloway was one of those men, and he was about to make that very clear. As the jet ascended, Shaq tried to ignore the subtle tension crackling through the air. He scrolled through his emails, responding to a few urgent messages, trying to push the unease aside. Then the turbulence started. Or at least, that's what Calloway claimed it was. The jet jolted sharply, sending Shaq's drink spilling onto the tray. He frowned, glancing out the window. The sky was clear. No storms. No clouds. The intercom clicked on again. "Apologies, folks. Seems we've got a little unexpected turbulence. Might be a bumpy ride." Shaq caught Olivia's eyes as she peered nervously from the galley. She knew something. It wasn't turbulence. This was intentional. Shaq sighed, grabbing a napkin to wipe off his tray. He had two options: call out Calloway's behavior now, escalate the situation, or wait. He chose to wait. Because men like Calloway? They always overplayed their hand. 30 minutes into the flight, Calloway's comments became bolder. When Shaq requested another drink, Olivia hesitated before responding. I'll check, sir." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Check?" She swallowed hard. "The pilot said we're, rationing beverages today." Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. "Rationing? On a private jet?" Then Calloway's voice came through the speakers again, smug and taunting. "Can't be letting just anyone drink the premium stuff, right?" Shaq didn't move. Didn't react. Calloway was pushing, testing, trying to get under his skin. Instead of taking the bait, Shaq simply smiled to himself. He had seen this game before. And Calloway? He had no idea who he was playing with. An hour in, Calloway made his biggest mistake. The plane lurched violently. Not just a small shake, but a deliberate, stomach-dropping maneuver that sent Olivia stumbling into the aisle, nearly falling. Shaq caught her arm before she hit the ground. She gasped, gripping his forearm, her breathing uneven. The engines steadied. The plane leveled out. Shaq's eyes remained locked on the cockpit door. Then he asked, voice calm but firm, "Is there a reason your pilot thinks this is a joke?" Olivia swallowed. "Sir, I can't say anything." Shaq stared at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. He wasn't going to put her in a position that could cost her job. Instead, he turned his focus to the real problem. He grabbed his phone, tapped into the flight's tracking system, and began recording. Because Calloway, he just crossed the line. And this flight, it was about to be his last. Shaq didn't storm the cockpit. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an apology. Instead, he played his game. He leaned back in his seat, sending the recording directly to his legal team. With a few taps, he looped in aviation regulators, the airline's executives, and a few high-profile contacts. Then, he calmly asked Olivia for a favor. "Tell Calloway I'd like to have a word when he has a minute." She hesitated, then nodded. 2 minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and Calloway strolled out, smirking. "Something wrong?" he asked, fake concern dripping from his voice. Shaq studied him, then smiled. "Yeah," Shaq said smoothly. "Turns out I recorded every word you just said." Calloway's smirk vanished. Shaq tilted his phone slightly, letting the screen glow in the dim cabin light. "This is being sent to the airline," Shaq continued. "To aviation regulators. To people who can make sure you never fly again." Calloway's face paled. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Now," Shaq said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you want to sit back down and fly this plane properly, or should I make a call and have this jet grounded the second we land?" For the first time since the flight started, Calloway had nothing to say. He turned stiffly, stalking back into the cockpit. The rest of the flight? Smooth. No more turbulence. No more insults. Just silence. Because Calloway finally realized who was in control. And when the plane landed, he wasn't the one walking away with his career intact. The private jet soared through the night sky, a smooth and quiet journey on the surface. But inside, the air was thick with something else. Something unspoken, yet heavy. Shaq sat comfortably in his seat, but his mind was alert, sensing the shift happening around him. He wasn't imagining it. The little things, the ones people thought wouldn't be noticed. His luggage, normally handled with care, had been shoved haphazardly near the back. His seat, usually preset with amenities, lacked the usual warm towel and water bottle. His request for a simple cup of tea had been accidentally ignored twice. At first, Shaq let it go. Not because he didn't notice, but because he wanted to see how far this would go. And it didn't take long for him to find out. "Attention passengers," came Calloway's voice over the intercom, the artificial politeness barely masking his underlying tone. Smug, mocking. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Might be a little bumpy, so buckle up." Shaq glanced out the window. The sky was crystal clear. Not a single cloud in sight. He felt the subtle deceleration of the engines. Not enough to alarm a regular passenger, but Shaq wasn't a regular passenger. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting toward Olivia, the flight attendant. She looked nervous. She knew. Her hesitation wasn't just the usual employee fear of displeasing a wealthy client. No, this was different. She wasn't avoiding eye contact with him. She was avoiding the cockpit. Shaq made a mental note. Calloway wasn't just being passive-aggressive. He was testing boundaries. Over the next 30 minutes, the hostility became more deliberate. When Shaq finally did get his tea, it was lukewarm and bitter, like it had been sitting out too long. He caught Olivia's apologetic glance as she set it down, but she said nothing. When he reached for a blanket, one of the luxuries of private flying, he noticed something else. It was thin and rough, not the premium fabric normally provided. And then came Calloway's next move. The intercom clicked on. Folks, just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how lucky some people are. You know, getting to fly like this. Private, exclusive. Not everyone deserves it, but hey, money buys anything, right? Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. The words were indirect, but they weren't vague. Shaq had dealt with people like Calloway before, the ones who hated seeing success in the hands of someone they never expected to have it. It was never about money, it was about power, ego, control. And Calloway? He was trying to prove something. Shaq decided to change tactics. Instead of confronting Calloway, he focused on Olivia. "Everything good?" he asked casually as she walked by. She hesitated. Too long. Then nodded quickly. "Of course, sir." Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You sure?" Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. I don't want to cause any trouble." Shaq's eyes darkened slightly. Cause trouble. That meant she already knew how Calloway operated. "How long have you worked with him?" Shaq asked. She hesitated again before answering. 2 years. Shaq nodded, absorbing the information. 2 years of this. 2 years of knowing how to stay quiet. Calloway wasn't just a rude pilot. He was a problem. And this wasn't the first time he had pulled something like this. Shaq decided to sit back and wait. He knew men like Calloway couldn't help themselves. They always pushed too far. And he was right. An hour into the flight, Shaq noticed something odd. The altitude was dropping slightly. Not dangerously low, just enough to disrupt the ride, making it bumpier than necessary. Then came Calloway's voice, smug as ever. "Sorry about the turbulence, folks. Guess we're just unlucky today." Shaq tightened his grip on the armrest. There was no turbulence. This was deliberate. Olivia flinched. She looked toward the cockpit door like she wanted to say something, then stopped herself. Shaq saw the conflict in her expression. She knew exactly what Calloway was doing, and she knew Shaq knew. Shaq had had enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt, moving toward the galley where Olivia was standing. She stiffened as he approached, clearly expecting him to be angry. But his voice was calm, measured. "Tell me," he said, leaning slightly closer. "Has he done this before?" Her eyes darted toward the cockpit again. I can't." Shaq gave her a look. The kind that said, "I already know the answer. Just confirm it." Her shoulders slumped slightly. Then, in a voice so quiet he barely heard it, "Yes." Shaq's jaw clenched, but he kept his cool. "How bad?" he asked. She swallowed hard. Bad enough. That was all Shaq needed. He wasn't going to argue with Calloway. That's what Calloway wanted. Instead, Shaq picked up his phone. A few taps later, he had his legal team, his personal security team, and an aviation official in a group message. He typed one sentence. "Pull everything on Jackson Calloway. I want his record by the time we land." He hit send. And then? He smiled. Because Calloway had no idea he just started a fight he couldn't win. 20 minutes before landing, Calloway made one last attempt to assert dominance. The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. I hope the ride has been comfortable for some of you. Though, let's be honest, some people never quite fit into first class, do they?" Shaq slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he laughed. Olivia looked at him, startled. Shaq met her gaze and said, "Don't worry. He's not going to have a job after this flight." Her eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Shaq held up his phone, where a message had just come in. Jackson Calloway. 3 previous discrimination complaints, 2 internal warnings, 1 FAA report under review. Shaq looked toward the cockpit, a slow smirk spreading across his face. The moment the wheels touched the runway, Calloway's career was over. And the best part? He had no idea. The plane landed smoothly, Calloway still carrying himself like a man untouchable. Shaq didn't move immediately. He let Calloway have his moment. Let him think he had won. Then, Shaq stood, stretched, and walked toward the cockpit. Calloway turned, that same smug smirk still in place. "Hope the flight was..." Shaq held up his phone. 3 discrimination complaints, 2 internal warnings, 1 FAA report pending review. Calloway froze. Shaq tilted his head. Anything you want to add before I send this to the airline's CEO? The color drained from Calloway's face. The arrogance evaporated. For the first time, he was the one speechless. And Shaq? He just walked past him, stepping off the plane. Because Calloway wasn't worth another second of his time. The hum of the private jet's engines filled the cabin, but inside, the tension was suffocating. Shaq sat comfortably in his seat, legs crossed, arms resting on the armrests. His expression remained calm, unreadable, but his patience was running out. Across the cabin, Jackson Calloway stood near the cockpit, his stance firm, shoulders squared. His smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, something uglier. Olivia, the flight attendant, hovered near the galley, her eyes darting between the two men. She wasn't just nervous anymore, she was terrified. Shaq exhaled slowly, and finally spoke. His voice was measured, his tone steady. If there's a problem, let's talk about it. Calloway let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if amused. But the amusement didn't reach his eyes. Problem, he echoed. No, sir. I just don't take orders from people like you. The cabin went silent. Shaq's fingers drummed against the armrest. Slowly, he leaned forward, locking eyes with Calloway. People like me? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Calloway's smirk returned, but it was tighter now, forced. Yeah, entitled, privileged, thinking you own the world just because you've got money. I've seen guys like you. Shaq let the words settle in the air. Then after a pause, he tilted his head. You mean guys who worked hard for everything they have? Calloway's jaw tightened. For the first time, he was thrown off balance. Shaq had seen men like Calloway before. They didn't start with outright hostility. No, they started with control. Small, calculated moves to make you uncomfortable, to make you feel like you didn't belong. And when that didn't work, they pushed harder. Calloway had expected Shaq to react, to get angry, to shout, to validate the image Calloway had of him. But Shaq wasn't playing his game. And that was infuriating. Calloway's fingers twitched at his side. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch. You think you're better than me, don't you? Calloway muttered, voice lower now, edged with something dangerous. Shaq let out a slow breath. I think, he said, his voice deliberate. You have a serious problem with people you can't control. Olivia let out a shaky breath from behind them. Calloway's smirk twitched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. For the first time, his mask was slipping. Calloway turned away, shaking his head. You people always think everything is about race, about power. Shaq cut him off, his voice sharp. I never mentioned race, Calloway. That was all you. Calloway stopped. His entire body went rigid. And that was the moment Shaq saw it. The frustration, the anger, the fear. Calloway was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Desperate to regain the upper hand, Calloway walked back toward the cockpit. Maybe I should call this flight in, he muttered. Tell them we've got a disruptive passenger. Shaq arched a brow. Disruptive? Calloway shot him a sideways glance. We both know how this goes. I say the word, and you're the problem. Shaq stared at him, unimpressed. That's supposed to scare me? Calloway's lips curled. It should. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He wasn't dealing with a pilot anymore. He was dealing with a man unraveling. Before Shaq could respond, Olivia finally found her voice. That's enough, she said, stepping forward. Both men turned to her. Her hands were trembling, but she stood her ground. You're crossing a line, Captain. Calloway let out a breathy laugh, looking at her like she was a child speaking out of turn. Stay out of this, Olivia. No, she snapped, surprising even herself. I've stayed out of it for too long. Shaq watched as she shifted. This wasn't just about this flight. This had been going on for years. Do you know how many complaints you've had? Olivia continued, her voice shaking. How many passengers, how many crew members have walked off your flights feeling... She swallowed hard. Like they didn't belong. Calloway's face darkened. That's enough. No, Shaq said, standing. I don't think it is. Calloway turned back to Shaq, nostrils flaring. You think you can ruin me? I'm the one in control here. Shaq took a slow step closer. No, he said, voice dangerously calm. You're the one begging for control. Calloway swallowed. His hands clenched. And then, Shaq pulled out his phone, turned the screen toward Calloway, and let him read the message. Jackson Calloway, 6 official complaints, 3 active investigations. Possible FAA suspension pending. Calloway's face drained of color. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. How much power do you think you have now? Calloway took a shaky breath, backing away slightly. The weight of his choices was finally hitting him. He had pushed too far. He had assumed he was untouchable. But now he knew better. The intercom crackled on. The co-pilot's voice came through. Captain, we're beginning our descent. Calloway barely reacted. Because now, he knew his career was about to crash before the plane even landed. Shaq returned to his seat, exhaling as he buckled in. Calloway, still in shock, stumbled back toward the cockpit. Olivia sat down across from Shaq. She looked lighter, like she had been carrying this weight for years and had finally put it down. Shaq glanced at her. You okay? She let out a nervous laugh. I should be asking you that. Shaq smirked slightly, shaking his head. I've handled worse. She studied him for a moment. Thank you, she said softly. Shaq gave her a nod. Don't thank me yet. She frowned. Why not? Shaq glanced toward the cockpit, his smirk widening. Because he's about to find out what it feels like to be grounded. As the plane touched down, Calloway's hands trembled over the controls. Because the second those wheels hit the runway, his career was over. And the best part? He had done it to himself. The moment the plane lurched downward, time seemed to stretch. The cabin lights flickered. Shaq's grip on the armrest tightened as gravity yanked him forward, his stomach twisting from the sudden drop. Olivia, the flight attendant, let out a muffled cry as she stumbled, barely catching herself on the seat beside her. A few unsecured items tumbled off the serving cart, clattering onto the floor. Then, just as suddenly, the engines roared back to life. The plane steadied. A second of silence. Then Calloway's smug voice crackled through the intercom. Oops. Guess that turbulence got worse. Shaq exhaled slowly, his jaw clenching. That wasn't turbulence. That was intentional. And now, this wasn't just about ego. This was about safety. Shaq had spent his life handling people like Calloway, men who wielded power like a weapon, just to see who they could make flinch. But this wasn't just arrogance. This was reckless endangerment. Shaq turned to Olivia, who was still gripping the back of a seat, her breathing uneven. He noticed the way her hands trembled, the fear lingering in her wide eyes. She had worked in aviation for years. She knew what had just happened. She met Shaq's gaze and whispered, "He did that on purpose." Shaq's expression didn't change, but his pulse ticked a little harder. He already knew. Up in the cockpit, Jackson Calloway smirked. He had expected a reaction, expected Shaq to storm up to the cockpit, yell, demand an explanation. But nothing. Just silence. His smirk faltered. Why wasn't Shaq reacting? The truth was, Shaq never reacted on their terms. And that's why Calloway was about to lose. The rest of the flight continued in tense silence. Olivia avoided the cockpit, her entire body rigid with unease. She served Shaq another drink, her hands still shaking slightly as she set it down. Shaq barely touched it. His mind was working too fast. Calloway had just made the worst mistake of his life. And the worst part? He didn't even know it yet. As they neared their destination, Shaq remained calm, composed. But his silence? It was calculating. He had already sent a message to his legal team, already started the process of gathering evidence. Because when this plane landed, Calloway wasn't going to walk away from this. And Shaq? He didn't need to lift a single finger to make it happen. Calloway's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent. Hope you enjoyed the flight." Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. Oh, Calloway, you have no idea what's waiting for you on the ground. The plane hummed steadily, gliding through the last stretch of its journey. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but smooth. Shaq sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked, his expression unreadable. Calm, calculating, dangerous. Across from him, Jackson Calloway leaned against the cockpit door, arms crossed, smugness still clinging to his face. But thinner now. Shaq had seen men like him before. Bullies in suits. Men who mistook their position for power. But Calloway. He had just crossed a line he couldn't step back from. Shaq exhaled slowly and leaned forward, his voice a quiet, deliberate warning. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. Calloway chuckled, but this time, the sound lacked conviction. It was forced, like he was trying to convince himself he was still in control. Shaq just stared at him, and Calloway felt it, the shift. For the first time, he was off balance. The tension was thick, stretching between them like a wire about to snap. Then Olivia spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. This isn't the first time. Shaq turned to her slowly, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Olivia hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door like she expected Calloway to pounce. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She had held this in for too long. He's done this before, she finally admitted. Intimidated passengers, abused his power, gotten away with it. Shaq sat back, processing. That was all he needed to hear. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. The final nail in Calloway's coffin was already being hammered in. Shaq's fingers moved smoothly over his screen, opening the flight's tracking system. Every move Calloway had made, the sudden altitude drop, the unnecessary turbulence call, the erratic speed changes, it was all being recorded. Shaq turned the phone so Olivia could see. Her breath hitched. Calloway's jaw clenched. For the first time, his smirk was completely gone. Calloway had spent his entire career untouchable. He had perfected the art of towing the line, pushing boundaries without leaving enough evidence to be held accountable. But now he was exposed, and worse, he had underestimated his opponent. Shaq wasn't just another passenger. He was the man who could take everything from him. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Let me guess, he said casually, eyes still locked on Calloway. You're used to getting away with this. Calloway swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. You don't know what you're talking about. Shaq smiled, slow, cold, final. No, Calloway, I know exactly what I'm talking about. He tapped his phone screen. A notification appeared. FAA violation report, submitted. Calloway paled. You didn't. Shaq's smile didn't falter. I did. Calloway's mind raced. He had connections, friends in high places. But Shaq was higher, and Calloway knew. This was it, his final descent. He turned toward Olivia, desperation creeping into his voice. You don't have to do this. Olivia didn't flinch. You did this to yourself. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged overhead. The airport was minutes away. Shaq leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. You know what's waiting for you when we land, right? Calloway's breath came shorter now. The Predator had officially become prey. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, a steady, rhythmic sound that masked the growing storm inside. Shaq remained seated, outwardly calm, but his mind was working fast, calculating every move. Calloway, standing near the cockpit door, still had that smugness on his face, but it was thinner now. He could feel it slipping, though he wasn't sure why. He had pushed Shaq, mocked him, tested him, and still, the billionaire hadn't lost his temper. That was Calloway's first mistake. Because Shaq wasn't the kind of man who yelled or threw punches. He was the kind of man who ended careers without raising his voice. And right now, that's exactly what he was about to do. Shaq tapped his phone screen, subtly adjusting its position on the table. The recording had been running for 10 minutes now. Every word, every sneer, every racist, condescending remark Calloway had made over the course of the flight. Captured. Shaq wasn't reckless. He didn't just rely on one piece of evidence. He had texted his team on the ground the moment things started feeling off. Now, aviation officials, legal experts, and the airline's CEO were all looped in. They were waiting for Shaq to land, waiting for proof. And soon, they were going to get everything they needed. Shaq had spent the last hour reading Calloway. He knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Arrogant, entitled, and worst of all, untouchable. At least, he thought he was untouchable. Calloway leaned against the cockpit door, crossing his arms. His tone was still laced with condescension, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "What's the matter, Mr. Shaq?" he asked mockingly. "Not used to things not going your way?" Shaq exhaled slowly. Then he smiled. A small, knowing smile. And that was when Calloway's smirk wavered. Shaq kept his voice steady, his tone almost conversational. "You know, I looked into you." Calloway's fingers twitched. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying him like a chess piece he was about to remove from the board. Discrimination complaints, safety violations, a history of power trips that mysteriously got swept under the rug. Calloway's face darkened. "That's none of your business." Shaq's smile didn't falter. "Oh, but it is." Then he turned his phone screen toward Calloway. The screen was filled with legal reports, internal complaints, and flight records. Calloway's past, the one he thought was buried, laid bare. The smugness vanished completely. For the first time, he looked scared. Calloway took a step forward, his voice lower now, more desperate. "You have no idea who I know." Shaq leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "And you have no idea who I am." The pilot's breathing quickened. He wasn't dealing with just another wealthy passenger. He was dealing with someone who could destroy him. And he had walked straight into the trap. Shaq tapped his phone one last time. Send. A confirmation popped up. The audio recording, the entire damning conversation, was now in the hands of the airline executives, the legal team, and the FAA. Calloway had officially lost. Shaq stood, adjusting his jacket. He met Calloway's eyes, cold, final. "This flight?" he said smoothly. "It's your last one." And then? Shaq walked past him, because there was nothing left to say. The plane touched down smoothly, but inside the cabin the real turbulence was just beginning. The moment the wheels met the tarmac, Shaq leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. It was over. Or at least, it was over for Calloway. Outside the window, the flashing lights of official vehicles lined the runway. Aviation officials, airline executives, and uniformed officers stood in a tight formation, waiting for the man who thought he was untouchable to finally face reality. Calloway, however, was still oblivious. He unbuckled his seatbelt with the same arrogance he'd carried throughout the flight, rolling his shoulders as if preparing to walk off the plane as the king of the world. Shaq watched him stand, his posture still dripping with confidence. But confidence without power? That was just delusion. And Calloway was about to learn that the hard way. As Calloway stepped toward the exit, Shaq remained seated, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. Olivia, the flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of it all, lingered near the back of the cabin, her hands clasped together tightly. She knew what was coming. And so did Shaq. Calloway took 2 steps down the stairway, the heat of the tarmac hitting him instantly. He barely had time to adjust before the low, authoritative voice of an official cut through the air. "Captain Calloway, step forward." The pilot frowned, as if confused. His smirk flickered, but he kept walking. Then he saw them. Uniformed officers, FAA representatives, airline executives, all waiting for him. Calloway's stride slowed, his brow furrowed. Then, it hit him. Shaq saw it happen in real time, the realization dawning on Calloway's face, the shift from arrogance to unease. And for the first time, he looked afraid. Calloway barely made it to the bottom step before one of the officials stepped forward, a crisp folder in his hands. "You are hereby grounded, pending investigation." The words landed like a slap. Calloway blinked. His throat bobbed. What?" The official didn't flinch. The airline has been presented with overwhelming evidence of misconduct, including safety violations, abuse of authority, and discriminatory behavior. Calloway's face drained of color. That was when he turned, not to the officials, not to his employers, but to Shaq, the man he had spent the entire flight trying to break, the man who now controlled his fate. "Wait, hold on," Calloway stammered, voice cracking. "This is a misunderstanding." Shaq finally stood, unhurried and composed. He adjusted his jacket, meeting Calloway's desperate gaze with an expression so calm, so utterly in control, that it sent a clear message. He had already won. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "That's funny." His voice was smooth, effortless. "I thought you didn't take orders from people like me." Calloway's lips parted, his face a mixture of shock, regret, and panic. For the first time, he was the one out of control. Calloway turned to the officials again, his desperation growing. "Listen, this is ridiculous. I've been flying for years. The airline executive stepped forward now, his expression cold and unforgiving. "And yet we've received more complaints about you than any other pilot in this division." Calloway stammered. "That's just noise. The executive didn't let him finish. "We also reviewed the flight recordings." He held up a small device. "Everything you said? Everything you did?" He gestured toward Shaq. "It's all been documented." Calloway's hands shook. His shoulders slumped slightly. He was unraveling. He had spent years getting away with it. Bullying passengers. Disrespecting those he thought were beneath him. Playing with power because no one ever stood up to him. But now, he had picked the wrong target, and he knew it. One of the uniformed officers stepped forward. "Captain Calloway, as of this moment, you are placed on indefinite suspension." Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. His face was pale now. His voice, once filled with arrogance, was suddenly small. You can't be serious."